So this is the second presentation on Aaron talking about his sailing experience.
Alors, c'est Aaron qui va présenter la navigation. J'ai pris ça, la vidéo en Chine, que je demande à un monsieur c'est l'ami de ma mère et mon père. Là, je l'ai demandé au restaurant et j'étais un petit peu fatiguée, alors j'étais comme ça. Puis là, j'ai demandé des questions, puis là, il va le dire en anglais. Merci.
So now I will talk to you a little about the history of sailing. So sailing or boat travel has permitted humans to go to new places. For example, if the boat was never invented, Canada as a country wouldn't exist. So you can see the boat was incredibly important to human history. Today I'll tell you a little about the history of sailing. First of all, what is sailing? Sailing is the act of traveling aboard a sailboat. It was very popular during early times, but when electronic devices and motors didn't exist. But nowadays, it is primarily practiced as a sport. The word sailing I'll be using the word sailing just like as boat travel. So most historians, people who study history, agree that the boat was invented around 800,000 years ago, somewhere in southern Asia. It wasn't invented by the human, but by its ancestor, Homo erectus. The southern part of Asia is full of islands. To get from one place to another, they needed a craft that would allow them to travel on water without sinking because the distances between land were too big to swim. The boats were extremely simple, much less complex than today's ships. The first boats were rafts, a bunch of logs tied together to form a platform. Then they were dug out of logs with axes and the oars were shaped from branches. They were called dugouts, obviously. The oldest known boat is the Pesse canoe, which was discovered in Pesse in the Netherlands. It's around 10,000 years old. 4,000 years ago, the boat became significantly more advanced. The Egyptians developed the reed boat, made entirely of dried papyrus with a sail. The Nile, a river the Egyptians traveled on, has a current going downstream, so they would sail downstream, then row back upstream. The boat was light and easy to maneuver. They got more advanced with time until today, where boats now have motors to make them move. Sailing was originally intended as a means of transportation for human migration and for adventure. But today the adventure part is still present, but sea voyage is used for leisure, scientific study, or transporting merchandise. The Polynesians were famous for their sailing abilities. They departed from Taiwan to inhabit almost all the islands in Oceania. Sailing has developed into a profession, and it isn't easy at all. Here are some techniques used in navigation. To ensure safety during a sea voyage and to be efficient, it is useful to know about meteorological conditions. In ancient times, there wasn't any weather forecast, so they had to predict the weather on their own by observing the clouds and by looking at the stars. Even so, traveling on boats was highly risky. It wasn't rare for boats to sink, so sailors had to be prepared for the worst. In spite of that, there are still some great navigators that made history by sailing. They were incredibly talented and brave for having attempted such great expeditions. Here are a few. Zheng He was a Chinese navigator who sailed from 1405 to 1433. He reached the east coast of Africa and had been to over 30 countries, including Somalia and Kenya. Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailor who sailed for Spain, discovered America, also known as the New World, in 1492. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean, which was previously unexplored, tried to reach China and India, only to land in America. Ferdinand Magellan, a little less known, traveled completely around the world, circumnavigated to prove that the Earth is round. Unfortunately, he was killed halfway by indigenous people somewhere in South Asia. To ensure that you and others are safe during a sea voyage, here are a few steps to take. 1. You must avoid hidden rocks and sandbanks that are close to the surface of the water. because you could run aground, endangering the ship and those aboard it. 2, it is best to know about the weather forecast in order to avoid storms which could cause shipwreck. But in case you run into one, it is useful to know what to do, to stay safe, such as how to maneuver the ship to avoid big waves, etc. 3, mechanical problems could appear while at sea, so being familiar with the insides of the ship is important. 4, and last of all, it is very important to know how to communicate with other ships for various reasons, including avoiding collision. To communicate between between each other, ships use a variety of means, including signal flags, which are a succession of flags strung onto the ship's mast, which form a phrase, and radios, which are a little like walkie-talkies. Another important factor is to know what to do in case of shipwreck. First of all, you have to make other people know you need help, of course. So this is called a distress signal or a mayday call. That is probably the most complicated procedure in this whole category. Second, you must preserve energy for later in case you encounter even more problems. Third, if there is land nearby, which is rather rare, move towards it because you are closer to help that way and might even save yourself. Fourth and finally, don't stay in cold water for too long because you could get hypothermia, which is when your body temperature is too low. You could die from hypothermia. An important thing to know is how to make a mayday call. Even if you're only a passenger on a ship, you might be the only person available to make that call. For example, other people might not be able to get to the radio because there's a fire, etc. Step 1 is to open the radio. Step 2, on a DSC radio, which is fancy for a radio specifically designed for making for sending distress signals, you simply need to press on a button to make the call. On other radios, you have to manually switch to channel 16, which is the channel for making distress calls. Press and hold the transmit button so other people can hear you. Then you must repeat Mayday 3 times in a row clearly. Then you have to give extra information such as the name of the ship, the nature, its location, the nature of the emergency, for example, the ship's on fire, and the number of people on board. Then you release the transmit button and wait for 30 seconds. If that doesn't happen, if there's no reply, you repeat from step 1 to 8. I now present you some fun facts after all that brain cramming of information. Why is the sea so salty? The sea is salty because seawater comes from all the rivers that flow into the sea. When the water from the rivers that flow into the sea. When the water in the river takes away little particles of mineral, also known as erosion, which happen to be salt. With time, there are a lot of mineral particles in the sea, which make it salty. Also, seawater evaporates, but the minerals don't. So, and then the evaporated seawater forms clouds that rains, and then the water goes back to the river, and then the process repeats. So there are more and more minerals in the sea, but the amount of water stays the same. How much water is required to survive a single day at sea? Fresh water is used primarily for hydration. An average of 2,500 milliliters are consumed a day by humans. The amount of water ingested per day depends on the person, but around 1,000 milliliters are ingested by eating. If a person sweats a lot and loses water by doing that, then he or she will require more water than someone who didn't sweat. In early times when food couldn't be preserved, grains, salted and smoked meat, and stem plants were usually carried aboard to be eaten. Nowadays, since food preservation is advanced, the food eaten is similar to that on land. How is weather predicted on ships? Weather forecast information is usually received via radio. Some more experienced fishermen are able to predict weather by observing the clouds and stars, like I mentioned earlier. Some bigger ships even have their own weather forecasting system. How is direction determined when sailing? Direction is determined by using a compass, the sun's stars, moon, and navigation markers like lighthouses and islands. Here are two great sources to learn how to find direction without a compass. This is useful not only when at sea, but in many other scenarios, such as when you are lost in a forest. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. Does anyone have any questions?
因为海水呢，它是从各个江河的水汇到海里面去，然后形成的海水，是吧？江河在汇到海里面的时候呢，它把大量的这个矿物质和这个盐类的物质还带到了海里面。在海里面呢，它只有水往上蒸发，它这个盐类物质就长期都是存下来的。这样的话呢，所以它海水它逐步的这个盐分就越来越高，所以它这个现在尝起来它是咸的。对，你能收到一个预报，这个预报呢就告诉你在哪个地方可能有危险的天气，这个时候就需要船长自己去做决定，我是怎么样去规避它。是，如果风暴比较小的话，或者我任务比较急的话，我就可以要穿越它。如果是这个风暴比较大，或者是这个船的这个抗风浪能力比较差的话，那船长必须要决策绕着这个风暴走，规避它，躲开它。